Hello, students, and good morning. Welcome to your first day of school. Um, and I'd like to congratulate you all for advancing from ninth grade and coming to 10th grade. Um, and I really appreciate that you guys are taking interest in this class, that you would like to learn more about African culture, um, how about African Americans and how they came to be in this country. A little bit background about me. My name is Dr. Faisal Mohammed Yusuf. I graduated from Buffalo State College. That's where I got all my diplomas. I got there my bachelor's and PhD in Africana Studies. So, but you can just call me Mr. Faisal. So now, I'd like you guys all to pull out your notes. I don't know if this is your first day of school. Some of you may be nervous. You don't have to be. I'll try to make this class as fun and easier as I can. So please, guys, pull out your notes and I'll take attendance. All right. Okay, is Hunter here? Hunter. All right. Present. Rebecca. All right. Mohammed. Yes. Timothy. Timothy. Over there. Yes. Alexa. Alexa. Yes. Hassan. Here. And finally, Krishna. Krishna. All right. All right. Looks like you guys are all present here today, and I really appreciate for coming here on your first day of your class. All right. So, what we're gonna be learning in this course it's Africana Studies. That's the title of the course, but can anyone tell me what Africana Studies mean? Anybody? No? Okay. Africana Studies, as Dr. Robert Lee Harris said, it is the multidisciplinary analysis of the lives and thoughts of people of African ancestry on the African continent and throughout the world. But you have to keep in mind that this does not only exclude to these three geographical places, such as Africa or Afro-America or the Caribbean. However, it can include any other places such as South America, Asia, Central America, and so forth. However, our main focus in this course for the next coming 9 months would be getting to know how African Americans developed in this country and how they formed as a unity. So how the question comes, how did African Americans came to be in this country, in North America, or throughout, or for that matter, throughout the whole Americas initially? It is estimated that between the period 1500s to 1860s, an estimate of 12 million, that's a lot of number, 12 million Africans from different places in Africa were brought here forcibly to what was called then as the New World. Okay. This is actually considered to be the largest forced migration in human history that relocated some 50 ethnic and linguistic groups. However, keep in mind, only a small portion of the enslaved, less than 500,000, were sent to North America. meaning a small portion came to what we know today as the United States. That's about less than 500,000. Okay, the majority took to places such as South America and the Caribbean. Okay. So after a while, as you can imagine, anybody being kept without their will eventually form some form of resistance, and this is the case we see with how African American slaves from their resistance when they were kept forcibly. Okay. So in the following, you'll see several clips, such as that happened in the United States as some form of revolt. Okay, so we'll take a look of some famous, or if you call it, some major slave revolts that happened throughout the United States. Okay. So please pull out your notes, and you can take notes while we watch this video, these small clips, okay? Okay, and the first one we have in 1712, the New York City slave revolt. This happened in New York City.
Slave Revolt of 1712 was an uprising in New York City, in the British province of New York, of 23 enslaved Africans who killed 9 whites and injured another 6. More than 3 times that number of blacks, 70, were arrested and jailed. Of these, 27 were put on trial and 21 convicted and executed. Events. While in the early 18th century, New York had one of the largest slave populations of any of England's colonies. Slavery in New York differed from some of the other colonies because there were no large plantations. Enslaved Africans lived near each other, making communication easy. They also often worked among free blacks, a situation that did not exist on most plantations. Slaves in the city could communicate and plan a conspiracy more easily than among those on plantations. Events that presumably led to the revolt include a decrease in freedom and status when the colony changed hands from Dutch to British. Under Dutch rule, freed slaves had certain legal rights, such as the rights to own land and to marry. After the British took over New Amsterdam in 1664 and made it a colony of New York, they enacted laws that restricted the lives of enslaved peoples. A slave market was built near present-day Wall Street to accommodate the increase in slaves being imported by the Royal African Company. By the early 1700s, about 20% of the population were enslaved black people. The colonial government socially restricted this group through several measures, requiring slaves to carry a pass should they travel more than a mile from home. Marriage was discouraged. They could not gather in groups larger than 3, and they were separated into galleries during church services. The men gathered on the night of April 6, 1712, and set fire to a building on Maiden Lane near Broadway. While the white colonists tried to put out the fire, the enslaved African Americans, armed with guns, hatchets, and swords, attacked them and ran off. Aftermath. 70 blacks were arrested and put in jail. 6 were reported to have committed suicide. 27 were put on trial, 21 of whom were convicted and sentenced to death. 20 were burned to death and 1 was executed on a breaking wheel. This was a form of punishment no longer used on whites at the time. The severity of punishment was in reaction to white slave owners' fear of insurrection by slaves. After the revolt, laws governing the lives of black and Indian slaves in colonial New York were made more restricted. Slaves were not permitted to gather in groups of more than 3. They were not permitted to carry firearms, and gambling was outlawed. Other crimes such as property damage, rape, and conspiracy to kill were made punishable by death. Free blacks were still allowed to own land. However, the land of freed black family of Anthony Portuguese that makes up a portion of present-day Washington Square Park remained in the hands of his daughter and her children. Slave owners who decided to free the slaves were required to pay a tax of £200, a price much higher than the price of a slave. In 1715, Governor Hunter argued in London before the Lords of Trade that manumission and the chance to inherit part of a master's wealth was important to maintain in New York. He relayed that this was a proper reward for a slave who had helped the master earn a lifetime's fortune and could keep the slave from descending into despair.
Alright, so as you saw, as you've seen in that clip, that small clip, that after a certain while, as I said earlier, people become they get fed up. Okay, so this is the same thing that happened in New York City. That the slaves, they got fed up of being forcibly kept without their will, and this was the result that we've just seen right now. Alright? Okay, and next up we have the Stonewall Rebellion. This happened a short while after the New York City. Even though it happened something about like 20 years, we can say that it happened short after a short time. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the Stonewall Rebellion, and this is also again a small clip that we will watch, and please, as I said, you can take notes. This may come up in quizzes and future tests, alright?
The Spanish are receiving and harboring all our runaway Negroes. They have found out a new way of sending our own slaves against us to rob and plunder us. We are not only at a vast expense in guarding our southern frontiers, but the inhabitants are continually alarmed. Arthur Middleton, acting governor, 1728.
On the South Carolina frontier, word spread of Africans and Indians coming up from Spanish Florida to attack planters, and of Spanish authorities offering runaways freedom on Florida soil. In Goose Creek, an Anglican minister complained of secret poisonings and bloody insurrections by certain Christian slaves.
South Carolina is a pot ready to boil over. Imagine coming into a setup that seems almost unbearable and finding that people have many of them have somehow rationalized it or are enduring it. You know, that's the best they can do. But you as a newcomer might feel, I'm not going to put up with this. Better to die trying to change this. And there must have been hundreds of people like that in South Carolina in the 1730s.
By the 1730s, close to 2,000 Africans were arriving at the port of Charleston each year. From 1735 to 1739, out of 11,000 slaves landed, more than 8,000 were listed as Angolans.
What develops is a sense among Europeans that slaves from certain areas have particular characteristics. Slaves from the Angola area are reputed among the English to be particularly difficult, to be rebellious.
In St. Paul's Parish, there were close to 1,000 new people who just a few years before had been taken from the Angola region of Africa.
One of them, we only know his name, a man named Jimmy, apparently had come recently from Angola. He may not even have spoken English, but he may have had strong contacts with other Angolans. He had to try to build alliances, not only with other Angolans, other new arrivals, but with other Africans, African Americans, people from a community he was not that familiar with. And apparently he succeeded.
During the early morning hours of September 9th, 1739, almost as soon as word is received in South Carolina that England and Spain are at war, some 20 Angolan slaves, led by the man named Jimmy, began marching towards St. Augustine and the promise of freedom. Just 30 miles from the Middleton's Oaks plantation at the Stono Bridge, they seized a general store where there were arms and powder. They killed the storekeepers and left their heads on the doorstep.
What better moment to start an uprising and try to strike out for St. Augustine and find freedom in Florida in the hope that the Spanish authorities are willing to grant freedom to English-speaking slaves who escaped from the Carolinas into Florida.
On the march south, the Africans did not kill every white they encountered. They spared Mr. Wallace, an innkeeper they knew to be kind to his slaves. But before the day ended, they had killed more than 20 people. As other slaves joined them, they became an army of almost 100, camped at the Edisto River, waiting for others to gather under their flag.
The entire force of English North America was going to come down on them, because this was an issue not merely for those in South Carolina immediately surrounding this area. This was an issue for every European colonist everywhere in the colonies to quash this and to provide some exemplary punishment.
Around noon, the nearest white settlers were alerted. By 4 in the afternoon, they caught up with the Negroes along the Edisto River and fired upon them. Eyewitnesses recorded that the rebels fought boldly, but at least 14 were killed or wounded in the first attack. Others were surrounded, questioned, and then shot. The armed colonists then turned toward Charleston, and on mileposts along the way, they left the heads of the executed men.
Just the way war transforms people, this terrible transformation into race slavery had changed people by the middle of the 18th century. The violence you see at Stono is a violence that had become pervasive in the culture. By the middle of the 18th century, this had become a way of life in the English colonies.
Stono was sort of the beginning of the concept that the black population had to be utterly controlled. And the legislation that came out of Stono, the Negro Act, took away whatever liberties the Africans had.
Freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, to earn money, to learn to read, all were outlawed. South Carolina imposed duties on all slave importations and encouraged European immigration in order to change the ratio of whites to blacks. The Negro Act became the model for slave laws throughout the mainland of British America.
Alright guys, so as you saw from that clip, the Stonewall Rebellion, born as a with it, after the slave revolt of the Stonewall Rebellion, we see that the Negro Act is best, okay, and as you just seen from the video, the Negro Act prevented, or for lack of a better term, snatched every little freedom the Africans had in this country during the slavery time. Now, moving on to our third and last clip, we have in 1831 the Nat Turner slave revolt. Nat Turner, who was an African American, also led this slave revolt against the white colonists at the time. So we'll take a look at this small clip, okay, explaining what or how it happened. All right, and as I also said, you have your notes out. You can take some notes. Again, this may come. Some of these things may come as questions in the finals or some of the quizzes that we'll be taking throughout the year. Okay, so now we'll take a look at this video, and please pay attention.
Story time with Mr. Beat.
Hi, my name is Mr. B. Before slavery was outlawed in the United States in 1865, there were at least 250 documented slave revolts. Probably the most famous of all of these was Nat Turner's Rebellion, also known as the Southampton Insurrection. Here's the story of Nat Turner's Rebellion.
Once upon a time, there was a slave named Nat Turner. He stood about 5'7", weighed about 155 pounds, and was very smart. He lived on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia. He often had visions, which he interpreted as messages from God. Because of this, he believed he was destined for some great mission. At an early age, he taught himself how to read and write. As he grew older, he learned how to manipulate his white slave masters. He was very disciplined, refusing tobacco and liquor, and spent much time fasting and meditating. Many other slaves began to look to Turner for leadership, and he became a preacher as a young man. On May 12, 1828, when Turner was 27 years old, he heard a voice while working in his owner's fields. The voice said, "The time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first." On February 11, 1831, Turner witnessed a solar eclipse and believed it was a sign from God to rise up and rebel. Turner began secretly spreading the word about his plans. On August 13, 1831, an atmospheric disturbance made the sun appear bluish-green. Turner decided this was the final signal, and 1 week later, he and 6 men gathered, and Turner laid out his plan. Using no guns and only knives, hatchets, and axes, they would kill all slave owners they could find, regardless of age or sex. One historian states that Turner called on his group to, quote, "kill all the white people." The rebels then traveled from house to house and killed every white person they encountered. Though they did spare a few of the poorer white homes, they ended up killing non-slave owners, women, and even children. A small child who hid in a fireplace was among the few survivors. Most were hacked to death with axes, stabbed, or beaten to death. Through the night, Turner's forces grew as he had thought it would. First a dozen, then 30, then 60, and perhaps got as high as 80 slaves. They killed approximately 60 before they were defeated by a local militia with twice the manpower. The next day, troops from as far away as Norfolk came to help. The white troops had guns, and the slaves did not. The rebellion was ended within 2 days. As many as 200 blacks were killed in the skirmish, and later 56 blacks were executed by the state for the rebellion. This means the number of black victims was much greater than the number of rebels or of white victims. The blacks who were executed had their heads cut off. The heads were mounted on large poles at busy intersections as a warning to other slaves. As for Nat Turner, he escaped and went into hiding. But on October 30th, he surrendered to authorities. In court, he pled not guilty, saying he felt no guilt. He was hung on November 11th. Afterwards, his body was skinned and chopped up into 4 pieces. Nat Turner's slave rebellion caused white people throughout the South to freak out and overreact. It also gave hope to slaves throughout the South that maybe slavery was on the decline. The biggest legal reaction to the rebellion? The Virginia General Assembly made it illegal to educate slaves. They couldn't read or write. You see, the smarter a slave was, the more they realized being a slave sucked. The end.
Alright, students, so that was a short, interesting video. Also, from what we've seen from the video and the narration by Mr. B, the African Americans, after the Nat Turner slave revolt, that even though it had massive impact, such as African Americans being more victimized after the month of the slave revolt, but we see that there are some positive things that come out of this slave revolt, led by Nat Turner. That we see that one of the negative things that came out was one of the positive things that came out was the Virginia law that was passed that legalized for the African Americans or black slaves to have the right to get educated, and also this education would become a good thing for the African Americans, because as they went on, they realized that being slave was not going to be the permanent option. Okay, and coming up next, we have the Jim Crow law. So we have the Jim Crow. The term actually came to be known as a bad thing, like derogatory label for African Americans, and this also represented the Jim Crow law represented African Americans in the United States for their segregated life. However, the Jim Crow law was enacted in 1875. That was when it was went into effect. All right. What is the Jim Crow law? The Jim Crow law is a set of laws that enforced racial segregation, particularly in the South during the end of the Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction period is when, after the Civil War, majority of the infrastructures in the South was destroyed, and this was the time to fix it. And this was known as the Reconstruction period. So it was actually during this time that we see the Jim Crow era was coming into effect. And after the Civil War, right after the Civil War, that was when the Jim Crow law became much harder and difficult for the African Americans in the United States. Alright, and so we have also one last video explaining the Jim Crow law and what it did, how it was enacted, who were the affected people, and so forth. So please, we have short time left for the class today. So we'll take a look at this video for our last video, and please pay attention. Alright. So, as you've seen from the small clip, the Jim Crow law, when it was passed, it enforced certain laws that made things actually much harder for the African Americans. And also, this was a time that African Americans thought that they were actually free, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes the Jim Crow law, which made things even much more harder for the African Americans. Okay, so after the Jim Crow period, we have certain developmental period or events that depicted the improvement of African Americans in this country. Okay? So, in 1738, we have the establishment of Fort Moss in Florida. This was the first free black settlement in what is now known as the United States. It said that there were about 100 blacks. They were mostly runaways from the Carolina state. They all went to this place to form what was known as the Fort Moss in Florida. This settlement and